We just recently crossed 5,000 subscribers on RetroBlasting, so first of all, a big thanks to everybody out there for subscribing. We wanted to sit down and just sort of answer some of your questions. We get a lot of questions from you guys, and so we thought this would be a great time to sort of just do a hangout and answer some of your questions you've sent in to us.
Yeah, we broke the questions down into categories because you guys sent in a lot of questions. So we're going to rattle on through these. Now, we can't answer all the questions in depth, but we're going to give each question, suitable attention. So sit back with us for a few minutes, and your question will probably be asked.
Yeah, so I just have them printed out here, and I'll start at the top. So it's been about 30 or so years since the action figure boom. Where do you see action figures 30 years from now?
I see action figures 30 years from now being an adult premium collectible for Gen Xers and early Gen Yers. I know that's sort of a doom and gloom prediction, but at this stage, unless something turns around and kids get away from the video games and get away from the smartphones and get back into playing with toys and imagination, I think toys are going to become sort of an oddity. They're going to become more of a knick-knack for an adult and/or something for a toddler to play with than the boom that we had when we were growing up.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you on that. Do you think toy lines like Star Wars Power of the Force, Episode 1, or potentially Episode 7 will ever hold a place in people's hearts the way the original Star Wars line has with us original Star Wars kids?
That's a tough question because the Power of the Force lines, the Episode 1 lines, those were super produced. Like, they were overproduced on a level because people really expected them to be valuable. They expected them to be collectible. It was just like everything else in the 90s with the foil stamped variant comic covers and the hologram baseball cards and, all of the different toys having all the collector's numbers on them. Like everything Star Trek in the 90s had a collector's number on it as if it was going to be limited. But they were made in huge quantities because they expected all these prospective collectors to buy them. And they did. And now they're not really worth much. I mean, a lot of retailers took a bath on Episode 1, and nobody likes the Power of the Force stuff anymore from Power of the Force 2 from 1995 on because they all are He-Man'd out. They're all beefy, and they've since remade all of those characters 5 or 6 times in Hasbro's run. So people who collect modern, they have to have a strange, weird nostalgia bone to go back and get Power of the Force 2. You see what I'm saying? It's like if you've got the best of the best action figures of the modern line that are already better representations of the Power of the Force 2 stuff, you don't need Power of the Force 2 anymore. And it's so prevalent and it's out there and it's bottomed out in price. I think it's going to be a long time before we see that stuff go up in value, if ever.
Yeah, I kind of think that the manufacturers of toys in the 80s really caught on that collecting was a thing. And so by the time the 90s came around, and particularly Star Wars stuff came around again, they just tried to milk it for all it's worth and then therefore drove the value of long term down. So I kind of don't think so in terms of answering this question.
Yeah.
Do you think 70s and 80s toy fandom and value will eventually die off with Gen X, or will they continue to be desired?
That's an interesting question because everything is generational and the interests of one generation are not the interests of the next. However, while I do think that a certain percentage of these toys that are peaking in value now might not be desirable later, I can think back to toys of the 30s and 40s, like Cupid dolls and things like that, which were highly collectible about 25, 30 years ago, and now they're not as collectible anymore. However, there are always objects from the past of pop culture that continue to resonate forward into the present. So, for example, the obvious example is Action Comics #1. Superman is still popular, so everybody wants his first appearance, the legendary 1938 comic book. It continues to rise in value. Similarly, things that have a lasting brand like Dick Tracy or Buck Rogers, like the Buck Rogers pistols from the 30s and 40s, the ray guns that kids played with, those continue to go up in value because of their beautiful design and because people still like Buck Rogers. They like that whole era. They identify with those characters, and they also just like the collectible itself. Because sometimes collectibles transcend nostalgia into sort of a work of pop art. And so for example, the Buck Rogers Disintegrator, early Golden Age comic books, those all have that appeal. And I would say that vintage Star Wars is definitely going to fall into that category in the future. It won't matter what generation is a Star Wars fan. All generations, 60 years from now, will seek out the vintage Star Wars toys. They might not seek out Sectars or Visionaries, or things like that, but they will seek out Star Wars, Star Trek, probably Indiana Jones if we're lucky.
Then again, they might seek out those other things because of the rarity. I mean, even things like the Cupid dolls that you were talking about, stuff from the 30s, 40s, if you go online, because they, as every year goes by, they become more rare, they become more valuable, the ones that are left that are in really good condition. So I would imagine things that are in very good condition, with some exceptions, would have some amount of collectability. It's just, who would be interested in collecting them?
Well, sure, but it also goes into that realm of what are they collecting them for? Because right now we're collecting our toys from the past to enjoy them. But down the road, it's going to be the few rare examples left are for investment and museums. I mean, that's the way it always turns out.
Right. Well, and of course there are collectors out there who are just sort of looking for the profits,
right,
even now. What are your thoughts on the recently updated HeMan 200X? Is that right? The new HeMan, the new Transformers, the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Voltron, Transformers, all of that. What are your thoughts on that? This particular person loved the new HeMan and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as well as the Thundercats. So,
my thoughts on those are it's a good way to get those brands, those franchises back into the faces of the latest generation. I know that they get clever with their reboots and they make them edgier or more interesting or more logical in some cases. We watched a few episodes of the He-Man reboot and it was all right. Giving Skeletor a backstory, I don't know how much that's worthwhile or valuable. There's something to me about mystery with some of those characters. The cartoons of our youth, what they did was they gave you just enough information to allow you to have fun, but they also left out enough information to provide you with imagination when you broke those toys out and played. So we could make up Skeletor's backstory. We could make up, King Randor's backstory or Man-at-Arms backstory for the most part. I think the reboots are cool because they give us sort of an expanded universe, sort of an alternate universe to enjoy if we want to. I certainly wouldn't want to discourage them from continuing to explore these characters because for me, even though I haven't delved into these reboots as much, I do think that keeping these characters alive is important. So, for example, not putting out another He-Man cartoon or not putting out another Transformers cartoon would kind of be like canceling Superman and Batman comics altogether and never doing another one. And I think that would be unfortunate. So even though I might not agree with some of the things that they're doing with some of these cartoons, not specifically, but they might not be in my style or my taste. I'm glad that they're out there because it always opens the door for more He-Man or more Ninja Turtles that I will like in the future, rather than seeing it die altogether.
Michael's got a lot more hope than I do. I personally, the new He-Man that I saw, I just wasn't really enamored with it personally. I know I may get hate for that, but that's okay. I think that it is good that they're continuing to make new takes on these properties. But I think that some of them don't translate to today's market very well. And I think He-Man's kind of like that, which is weird. But, characters like Orko and even Skeletor are very funny characters. But there's not a lot of humor in a lot of the things that I see. They're very serious and they're very explaining everything. And so it feels strange to see something like Orko in a cartoon that's so serious. So it just came off as a little odd to me, but maybe I'm just looking at it wrong. I don't know. Are there any modern properties that would have been interpreted just as well or better in the 70s or 80s?
Oh, modern properties that would have been interpreted better in the 70s or 80s. That's a very weird question. And I don't know how to answer it. So we're going to have to move on.
Yeah. But thanks for the question. It's certainly a brain teaser. If you guys have any ideas on what the answer would be, just post it in the comments below.
Yeah, I'll give it some thought and possibly do a write-up on the Facebook page once I give that question some more brain power, because it's kind of like an Escher painting where it's a stairway that goes nowhere for me. So,
Do you think there is anything that toy companies and Do you think there is anything that toy companies and retailers could do to help bring back the action figure market to the greatness of the 80s and 90s?
yeah, the thing they could do is actually start coming up with original ideas. I mean, right now, toy companies are just slaves to licensing. They don't actually generate any new product on their own. And, in the 70s and in the 80s and somewhat into the early 90s, they were coming up with their own ideas. They were coming up with things like sectars, and they were coming up with, visionaries, and they were coming up with, Mask and Zoids and, Manglores and, all these weird things that they came up with back then. They don't do that now. Now they wait for something to get licensed, and then after they license it, that's when they make a toy line off of it. They wait for a new superhero movie or, some other big blockbuster. But back then, toys were unto themselves before there was a cartoon or a movie. It was the toy that inspired extra entertainment. It wasn't the entertainment that inspired the toy.
Right, and I think that's a big point to make, is that, things now are all just spin-offs of whatever the hot trend is, which is different from month to month. So there's no staying power behind any of it. If they had really, if they had a new toy line that wasn't related to anything yet and just came out and it was awesome, then, like Transformers, but a new version of that. And then, then they made movies off of that, that would be awesome.
Right.
So, related to that, if you walked into a toy store today and saw something that sparked hope for the next generation, what would it be?
Well, I've been in a toy aisle recently because every time I go to a store, I have to walk into the toy aisle. It's something that hasn't changed since I was a little boy, and I think what inspires hope for me are the Imaginext toys from Fisher-Price. Those toys are awesome. I mean, sure, Lego is a new powerhouse now. It's really grown in influence, and I'm glad that it's there. But I don't really see Lego as a traditional toy. It's a building toy. It's its own entity. Whereas your standalone play sets and action figures, Imaginext has really captured that market, and so that gives me hope for the little kids. I'm hoping that they won't be so inundated with iPads and things that they'll quickly forget about those things as they grow into grade school. I don't have a lot of hope for that, but the Imaginext toys are so cool that, as a matter of fact, I have one right here. It's an Imaginext Dragon. It was so cool that I actually picked it up from Target. I mean, this thing's awesome, and there's a castle that goes with it and stuff. So I guess my point in saying that is I'm hoping that things like this will actually give kids nostalgic feelings about toys as they get older, and they'll remember these even if they didn't have anything after that, which would be a shame, but it's probably what's going to happen.
As for me, what would give me some hope is to finally see the girls' toys that are in the toy aisle not just be about fashion and being like basically how to stay at home and vacuum and clean the house and play dolls and stuff like that. Like something that inspires imagination just like boys' toys do. Like, some cool like space adventure thing. Like maybe the How to Tame Your Dragon movie will inspire something like that. Like, I guess the Hunger Games kind of gave girls the desire to learn how to do archery, but so something more in that vein would be great. Why do you think retro toys and shows appeal to a younger generation and in countries where they weren't available?
Well, the retro toys appealing to people in countries where they weren't originally available is just simply because they've gotten their hands on the cartoon or television show, they've enjoyed it, they find out there's merchandising, and then they seek it out. It's no different than here. There were toy lines here like Galaxy Rangers let me back up. There were shows here like Galaxy Rangers, but the toys ended up only being sold in Europe.
Right.
So all these kids in America never got their hands on Galaxy Rangers toys. Now they really want them, so they seek out European markets to find the old toys again. It's the same thing in reverse, except more so, because a lot of our products here in America didn't make their way to other countries, even though the television shows and the cartoons did. And then, what was the second part of that question?
Basically, why do you think that the toys appeal to a younger generation?
Oh, younger generation. Yeah, I think they appeal to a younger generation for the same reason they appeal to us. I've talked to a lot of people on the YouTube channel, commenters who say that they're teenagers or they're younger kids and they love all of the stuff that we grew up with in the 80s. And they say to me that it has to do with the fact that the designs were cooler, the characters themselves were a lot more developed, just the depth of the universes that were created were more interesting. The toys themselves, the huge play sets, the variety was there, and that's not something they're getting now. So there are a few enlightened little kids out there that love this stuff, and they feel like they were born in the wrong era. I guess it's kind of like somebody who really likes World War II, and they grew up, in the 90s or in the 80s, and they're like, oh, I wish I could just be a fighter pilot in World War II. So yeah, I feel their pain.
Yeah. I think if it's a good concept, it's a good concept. If it's a great story, it transcends all of that. So I think that's pretty much what you're saying. And this is an interesting one. Can you explain how there have been rebirths of Transformers and G.I. Joe, but not Mask?
Yeah, I can explain that one. The reason that Mask has not been reborn is because Mask is now owned by Hasbro, because Hasbro purchased Kenner. And then when Hasbro purchased Kenner, they instantly owned Mask. And Hasbro is not interested in making any toys based off anything that isn't a cartoon or movie that's been greenlit. And they're really not interested in making toys or properties from things they didn't already own outright. So, for example, even though they don't have to pay a licensing fee on Mask, they also didn't create it. So they're not really emotionally invested in resurrecting it. So they're really only interested in keeping Transformers alive, and My Little Pony, and G.I. Joe on life support, and then supporting all their other stuff like, Star Wars, the Marvel films. That's really where their bread and butter is, because that's that's kind of the corner they've painted themselves into. And even though there's this clamoring for Mask and for other toy lines like Mask to come back, they don't understand that they're not willing to take that risk because they don't see any potential in grabbing a wider audience when it comes out. They have no faith in it. So that's the depressing answer.
All right, now we're going to move into questions about our opinions and favorites on things. So,
okay, cool.
What do you think the clunkiest action figures of the 80s were?
The clunkiest action figures of the 80s. Easily Galoob's A-Team was really bad, and we'll be doing a video about that in the near future. Anything Remco made was pretty clunky. If you've seen the Karate Kid figures or the Secret of the Ninja, as cool as the box art was for Secret of the Ninja, the action figures are pretty clunky. Yeah, those would be my top two picks.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm going to just kind of stick with My Little Pony for all these. So they're clunky because they don't move, but they're awesome. So, which figure or toy line do you prefer between Marvel's Secret Wars and DC's Superpowers?
Superpowers. Superpowers had more value. You got more for your money with Superpowers. You got an action feature, which, although I'm not really a huge fan of mandatory action features, I did like the posability, the optional posability of Secret Wars better. But the Secret Wars quality control was really bad. Superpowers had the cloth capes with the insignias. They had the better play sets. They had the better vehicles. They had the better variety of characters. With Secret Wars, the paint was really bad. The accessories didn't make any sense. The lenticular shields were just out in left field. So yes, Superpowers.
All right. What's your favorite retro figure released during the action figure renaissance of the mid to late 90s through the early aughts?
Mid to late 90s through the early aughts, a retro action figure. I would say it would have to be Bespin Duel Luke Skywalker from the Star Wars Saga line. He was one of the few that I went out and bought when it came out. And even though he has a mandatory action feature, he came with a metal-hilted lightsaber with a removable blade. He came with a removable hand that was magnetic, so you could attach it back to him. He looked all beat up like he did on Cloud City. And he came with the weather vane on a suction cup so that you could hang him from the underside of Cloud City. It's probably one of the coolest action figures they've ever made, and in the history of Star Wars and the history of Hasbro. So even though I just badmouthed Hasbro, I will give them points for that figure. I thought it was pretty good.
Do you have it?
Yeah, I've got it in a bin over there.
Okay, what toy line do you guys think was the absolute best from top to bottom, and specifically had the most influence?
Had the most influence. Star Wars definitely influenced the 3 3/4-inch action figure boom. It influenced the playsets variety, the vehicles variety, bringing imagination into these scenarios beyond the movies that the toys were based on, or the cartoon or whatever. And I know that's a cliche answer. A lot of people would say, oh, G.I. Joe or whatever. And I'm like, well, G.I. Joe certainly inspired a lot. I would say G.I. Joe is equal to Star Wars. If I wasn't allowed to say it was number 2, I would say it was equal, because I wouldn't make it number 3, because G.I. Joe inspired Leonard's The Core. It inspired so many different knockoffs. It inspired that O-ring construction on the action figures for many different lines. Even though Mego was using it before, it proved the model, much like Star Wars proved the scale. However, G.I. Joe was unto itself its own entity, meaning nobody could really touch it with the size of its playsets and the number of its playsets and the number of its vehicles. And so it's hard to say whether or not it influenced so much as scared other toy companies away. So yeah, I would say Star Wars and G.I. Joe. I know a lot of people would say that, and short answer on this one, HeMan inspired a lot of fantasy sword and sorcery knockoff toys, Galaxy Warriors, things like that. They also inspired other people to jump in, like LJN with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then the scale of those figures, I'm almost convinced, inspired the scale for Playmates Ninja Turtles. Right. I really feel like when Ninja Turtles came around, they were trying to capture the market that He-Man was exiting. But a lot of people say that Transformers influenced a lot, and I just tend to disagree with that, not because of my opinion on Transformers, but simply because all Transformers really did was come out as a competitor to a number of other transforming toy and robot toy lines, and it just happened to be the victor. But no, I don't think it had. It influences itself, but I don't think Transformers has really been influential in other toy lines.
I'm just imagining the hate we're gonna get for that.
You know what? I'm so used to hate by now. I just don't even care. I don't even care. Yeah, torch me. I don't care.
Yeah. Okay. So, do you like certain toy lines that never had their own show, weren't made by a famous company, or weren't mass marketed, yet are worth hunting down?
Read that one more time.
So basically this person's asking if there are any certain toy lines that either didn't have their own show and they weren't famous, but they're still worth hunting down. Like, they're really cool. They just aren't super well known.
Yeah, Starcom. Starcom is really cool. I would hunt those down. The magnetic astronauts with the the wind up features and mechanisms, so you don't need batteries. Let me think. Starcom is like the one that really jumps out at me. If you like anime, or you like 80s anime, then certainly, Robotech would be one to track down. But Matchbox Robotech has its limitations, which we'll get into in a very, very near future video. The action figures are ugly, the durability is bad, they're fragile pieces. But that was what was available for Robotech. So that was the toy line. So it has that added punch. They haven't really made anything to substitute for it since. And I'm starting to have a real appreciation for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons from LJN.
Oh, yeah.
That's a line that you should really start to track down. I'm starting to piece it together myself. and I've been nothing but impressed with it. So yeah. And I got to give a shout out to Captain Power, because Captain Power's toy line, while brief, was high quality, and the action figures were great, and the fighters were great. So yeah, those are my answers.
Cool. Of all the unsuccessful toy lines that never made it beyond a second year, which ones do you believe deserve to have performed better at retail and were killed off too prematurely?
Easily Kenner's Raiders of the Lost Ark toy line, the
Definitely.
Indiana Jones toy line from Kenner in 1982, deserved a second year, deserved a third year. It was one of the best series of toys ever, and I know I sound like a broken record. We are going to have a video on it in the very near future where you will see all these toys.
We really do have a lot of these ideas partially constructed, written up, and things like that. It's just a matter of getting time to film all of them and the B-roll and whatnot. So, and we also are constantly building the collection out to be sure we have, really good examples to show you guys.
Right, because our policy is we will not show you anything that's incomplete or, a mechanism that's broken unless we're making a point about the fragility of a specific toy. And to Melinda's point, we have a pile of scripts like this that we just keep, working on. But we are getting around to filming new videos. We had a very busy first half of the year with convention appearances, which you saw. But we're going to be getting back into our old groove here, very soon. So you'll be seeing new output, here in the next few weeks.